going to get started, and thank you so much for joining us. We are going to start by introducing our guest, but before we do that, we just want to understand why are we here today. All right. So this week we are celebrating the Small Business Week, the resilience, the tenacity of entrepreneurs who are doing their part to change the world. But before we talk about businesses, before we talk about small businesses, everything is made by people. It all comes down to people. And we can never talk about people if we don't talk about culture. There is a famous Peter Drucker quote that says that culture is strategy for breakfast. This literally implies that culture of your company always determines success regardless of how effective your strategy might be. So culture is not about these comfy chairs or offering coffee or offering wine during happy hours. It's more about how Nimi from Rwanda interacts with Sam from the US, all right, how they understand each other and how they appreciate that everyone's background is actually important and how they handle the pressure and respond to different challenges. So today, we have invited Peter and Bob to share with us how to build cultural intelligence in our company and how to navigate these challenges that come with it. So just a little bit of more introduction on who is Peter and who is Bob. Peter Kovacs is a Silicon Valley-based executive coach helping entrepreneurs and C-level executives to change and to rise the game for their companies' careers and impact the global stage. So, meaning that he has this background when it comes to cultural intelligence, and he has been in different countries and has interacted with a lot of people from the world. Also, Bob has the same background when it comes to cultural intelligence because he mentors several founders locally and globally through NASDAQ Entrepreneur Center. He's passionate about connecting startup founders with subject matter experts and investment capital to accelerate their success. So a warm welcome to everyone who joined us here. You might be an entrepreneur, you might be a small business owner, you also might be an aspiring entrepreneur. So welcome. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Peter to just like take the stage and take us on this journey of cultural intelligence and then give us a little bit more insight. You're welcome, Peter.
Yeah, with pleasure. So just want to make sure you can hear me well. Yeah, and you can see the, I'm gonna make the slides full screen. If you don't see it or there's some issue, just let me know because I won't be able to see, the chat. Yeah. Also, if there's some questions that come up, please keep an eye on the chat. I'm happy to stop and answer them as they come. There will also be time at the end. Okay. So first of all, welcome. I'm so happy to be here. So thank you very much for having me. And so on the agenda today, we're going to talk about some of the trends and challenges that are shaping our world today, including how we work. We're going to talk about cultural intelligence, getting a better understanding of what that is. That's also connected to diversity. When you have diverse teams, how that plays. And then culture, really understanding what that is because it's not obvious at the get-go. And then how to develop your cultural intelligence, which is how you become a global leader. And then we also have some space for questions at the end. Now, first, a little bit more about myself. So I originally hail from Hungary, but then grew up in Algeria and then Montreal, before moving to California to open the first office of my fourth startup. So a lot of startup adventures. So 4 companies over 15 years, a lot of learning experiences, and finally a successful exit. Then I traveled the world. And now, as was said, I'm an executive coach, which means that there are many kind of coaches. The kind of coaching that I do is a thinking partner. I work with founders, CEOs, C-suite, change makers, impact entrepreneurs on goals that are so aspirational that they know they need to undergo a level of personal transformation. Unlike most coaches who work on how you're doing things, I work on who you're being. Personally, I find that it's deeper and more valuable. Now, in terms of where we live today, this is an exciting time. You have drones taking really cool pictures. You have like VR, you have electric cars. Tesla, maybe one day I'm going to own one, For now, I just admire them on the highway as they zip by me. But one of the areas where the most change happened has to do with this. This is what my telephone looked like, except it was red, back when I was growing up in communist Hungary. And now you have FaceTime. You can see the other person in full color. Doesn't matter where they are. There's no issues about long distance fees and all those other issues. The other big change has to do with this piece of paper. Now, without reading, guess what this is? Is it some kind of maybe fancy check? No, this is a plane ticket. That's how plane tickets look like. It was came into this small booklet, almost like a checkbook. And I remember I was so scared that I would lose these pieces of papers and I would be stranded in some foreign airport. I never found out what happens when you lose it. But now you have mobile boarding passes, easy, check in, you do all these things easily. So what happens is it's easy to communicate with anybody from around the world, easy to move around. So people from different cultures shift, they move to seek better opportunities or just for fun. So what this means that you have people from different cultures working together, whether locally or internationally. But what hasn't changed is that there's still people working with people. And sometimes there's some differences which create conflicts. Now, these differences could be around working styles, communication, values, culture, as we discussed, perception, worldview. And when that happens, you have a breakdown in trust, in communication, processes in the company, a lot of time wasted. The productivity, the quality of the output is not what it's supposed to be. Now, let's look at perhaps what does that look like in more specific terms. So when I was in Kenya, I remember that often there was a talk about Nigerians in a not so positive way. And then I had a client who is from Nigeria who was traveling to Kenya, and there was some friction, some challenges he did not understand. Well, what happens is how somebody prefers to communicate, what they see as polite is different. On the Nigerian side, you're more direct. On the Kenyan side, you're less direct. So somebody who is used to being less direct, for them, somebody who's very direct could come across as rude. Now, the Nigerian doesn't mean to be rude. They communicate the way they always communicated, what's normal to them. But you see, the rule for what is polite can change from one culture to the other. Look at US and India. So many US companies have outsourced to India, and some funny situations happen. One of my clients first worked with China. Now in China, most people don't speak English. So he had to hire a translator. Now the translator acted to translate not just the language, but also the culture. So when the other counterpart was saying something, they could translate, their words, but also what they really mean. But when this person did business in India, he was happy to find out that Indians speak English. But the culture is still not the same. So when he asked his counterpart if a certain project will be ready in 3 weeks, the Indian person said yes, an English word. But what happens is that what he understood as the American was, it will be ready in 3 weeks. What the Indian person meant was, yes, I understand you. He did not mean that it's going to be ready. So you can imagine 3 weeks later, there was a surprise and frustrations and whatnot. If you look at France and the US, that happened. Many French people are here with me. I also have a background in the French culture. I studied that culture for a long time, so I appreciate this. The way feedback is given. For Americans, first they give the positive really directly, and then indirectly the negative. For French people, it's the other way. They give you the negative feedback first, very directly, because they want to make sure you understand, and then don't waste time on the positive, unless it's really exceptional. So often you have French people coming here. When it comes time to do the performance review, the American starts with the positive. So the French person assumes that if they start with the positive, there's nothing negative, and they stop listening. So they never get what the manager was trying to tell them. And you can imagine that happens a few times. The American manager gets very frustrated. Oh, this person is incompetent. They don't listen. Sometimes the French person gets fired, and they're so surprised because for them, all these levels of feedback was always positive. And finally, time perception. You might have a young Colombian man going to an interview in Germany. He's very eager, very happy to be there. and he shows up for maybe at 5:08 for a 5 o'clock meeting. For him, he's on time. He's a flexible perception of time. But for the German person, they associate punctuality with respect. If you're late, even a minute, it's a sign of disrespect. So the manager might look at this young man and say, like, oh, how incompetent, how rude, how poorly raised, all these negative things, while the only issue is they have a different perception of time. Now, if this German person has some cultural intelligence, they might first question, like, what's going on here? Oh, maybe they come from a different culture. Maybe there's a different perception of time before they start judging. So what can we do? What can we do now that increasingly we work across cultures? Whether it's in the same office, like here in California, I had several teams I worked with. You had like people from 3-4 continents in the same room, or often internationally. So that's where CQ comes in. CQ is the new EQ. Maybe 20, 30 years ago, emotional intelligence was coined as a term, as something that is really helpful for leaders. It has always been helpful, just people didn't know what it was. Some leaders were really good, some not. There was an incorrect perception that emotions, this is not a thing of business, or it's not what men do, because back then most leaders were men. But then somebody understood that no, emotions are useful for in all cases, especially as a leader. But if you work across different cultures, that's not enough. That's when you have CQ, cultural intelligence, that comes on top of emotional intelligence. And what is it? Let's see. The definition is simply that it's the ability to relate and work across cultures effectively. It's basically building relationships, good relationships with anyone, wherever they are. Now, what is cultural intelligence? First, it's not automatic. It doesn't depend where you live or how much you've traveled. There's a common misconception that, somebody who has traveled a lot, they have great cultural intelligence. It's not the case. If you're close-minded, doesn't matter what amazing opportunities are around you to learn. It will stay outside of your mind. There was this one Coca-Cola executive that I met. He's been to 50 countries, but he always stayed as the best Western. He never exposed himself. He was trying to stay with what's familiar. And from the brief conversation I had, clearly his cultural intelligence was not very high. Now, it doesn't depend on where you worked also. The good news is that anyone can develop it. Now, let's look at what the experts say. Cultural intelligence, or CQ, is the #1 predictor of success in today's borderless world. This comes from David Livermore, one of the academics who has coined this term, who's worked on this. He has a number of really good books. Now, what happens if you don't have cultural intelligence? So that's when you have a lot of confusion, frustration. You have wasted time, of course. You might seem self-centered. And you're in today's world when you have to work across different cultures. And by the way, cultures is not just somebody with another passport. It's also different generation, different gender, different profession. In my last company, we had engineers and salespeople that were so different that could have come from a different country. Now, with a CQ, these are people who fear what is different. Now, on the other side, what happens if you have cultural intelligence? Well, you have better judgment because you have more perspectives. You have been exposed to a wider range of angles. And also, as a leader, you can connect with each of these different people from different countries to really get access to their wisdom, their points of view, better job opportunities, higher salaries, because you are competent in more environments, and a wider range of opportunities are open to you, not just the ones where it's in your tiny comfort zone. Enhances creativity and innovation. Again, especially if you have people from different points of view, different cultures who see the problem from a different angle. So together you have more opportunities to find a better solution. And ultimately, you have a more interesting group of friends, higher quality of life. Like when pre-pandemic, when I used to have my accents or sexy international cocktails, there was so much diversity. We had maybe 20, 25 people from maybe 18, 20 countries. We had every shade of skin color, every continent except Antarctica was represented. It was so much more fun than when, let's say, I was hanging only with Hungarians, only with Americans. But the most important thing is that these people intuitively understand the differences and similarities between their cultures. And when they see a difference, they look at it as an opportunity to learn, not something to fear. So why should you care? Now, as the leader, you aspire to a diverse team, create a more inclusive culture so everybody can fully show up. What I know is never as powerful as what we know. So really get all those insights. But the collaboration, whatever they are, with cultural intelligence, you can figure out like, okay, it doesn't matter if you've never dealt with that culture. You have the tools to figure it out, and better solutions, more productivity, and in a way, you become a global leader. For those here who care about social impact, better solutions, more inclusive and wider impact, because you are looking at what the needs are, what the real needs are across a wide range, not just from your perspective. It's about delivering not what you think they need, but what they really need. There was this one example where there was a company trying to protect the environment. And what they did, they approached communities in areas where they need to protect the environment. Instead of assuming what they need, they asked, hey, we want to protect the environment. What do you need? And the answer was sometimes surprising. In Madagascar, a group said they want healthcare. Healthcare? What does that have to do with the environment? What happened is that when they had health issues, then they would have to stop working. Then they could not afford the more environmentally conscious, fuels for cooking or whatnot. And they would have to cut down the woods, the trees that were protecting the environment. So by providing healthcare, it was able to limit damage to the environment and have them be good stewards of the environment. And for all of you who care about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, this is the way, because we have such big challenges. Just one person cannot figure it out. You need to connect with the different experiences. Just a scientist is not enough. People who are on the ground might know something that people in the ivory tower will not understand. There was this example where you had a group of American engineers who went to, I think, Liberia to rebuild a school because the roof had some issues. And so they had some ideas. Now, the locals politely said, like, maybe that's not a good idea for the material because when the rains come, that might not be good. And these people had no degrees in engineering, but they had the wisdom of the land. Now, the engineers thought, oh, they are the engineers. They come from America. They have a lot of degrees. They know what they're doing. They ignored the advice. They built the school roof as they planned, and then the storms came. And what happened? The roof collapsed, and children and some teachers were killed. These were the engineers who are supposed to know everything, but they didn't listen. Nobody knows everything. But when you have cultural intelligence, you can connect across these barriers and really get all the information that you need. For some of you who are in tech and innovation, a higher creativity, more innovation, faster execution, competitive edge, because you have a small team, you have limited resources. So maximize all the brain trust of everybody who is there, and you benefit everybody. Now, for those who like numbers, I come bearing gifts. So McKinsey said that ethnically diverse companies are 35% more likely to outperform their peers. Organizations with women on their board outperform their peers. And finally, Deloitte said inclusive teams outperform their peers by 80% on team-based assessments. So you see diversity, cultures, diverse set of cultures together is so wonderful. Now, what is culture? It's more than your country. It's more than just how you dress. It's a set of beliefs, values, and behaviors. Now, on a simplest way, the way I like to put it is, it's what's desirable and what's acceptable. One expression I often hear is, well, it's how we do things around here. That's the culture. One way to understand culture and the different nuances is the iceberg approach. What you see of people, the jollof rice, the way they dress, the nice music that was playing earlier, that's what you can observe. That's above the surface. But that's driven by what's below the surface: perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, values. These things are difficult to observe directly. It's when you connect, when you are curious and you spend time, and that changes over time. Geography, history, media, all these things change. Let's say in the media, when some leaders speak in certain ways, certain approaches to the truth, that might shift what's acceptable with the common people. So you see how that can shift some of the situations. Also, geography, in a place where it's really harsh, where what they might value more, what might happen is they might value more helping others, helping strangers. Now, what's important to understand when it comes to the behavior, what's on top of the pyramid, what you can see is that there's 3 levels. You have what's universal. When we see a loved one, all of us will smile. So that's universal. Then you have cultural. If I do something that most of my people, let's say Hungarians or Canadians or whoever do, that's cultural. So it's representative of a group. But also sometimes what I do is very personal. It's just a quirk that I have. So when you meet somebody, it's about figuring out, well, who that person is. How much of what they do is just them. How much what of what they do is their group that can help you navigate the situation. Now, let's play again. So I'll bring in something that is very American culturally. Some of you who are based in the US, maybe might have heard about this guy. Who here knows who this is? So anybody? This is Steve Harvey. There's a game here called Family Feud. And so it's very popular. And this guy has a great sense of humor. Now, let's play the game a little bit, just in your mind and maybe in the chat. So communication is one of the cultural dimensions. So culture is set up in different dimensions, and each is like a spectrum, goes from one extreme to the other. So there's 2 extremes, and you can be anywhere in between. Steve Harvey. So in the chat, I can see the chat, so maybe we can play a little bit. So who here can guess what are some other dimensions of culture that you might imagine? Put it in the chat. I'd love to see what else you can guess. So communication is one. What's another aspect? Dressing, okay, that could be good. Clothing. So this is again for the more like on the surface level. But what is like the insider? Not the behavior, but the culture, like inside. In communication, you can hear the person, but it's based on what they think, more indirect or direct. Beliefs, very good. Leadership, excellent. So that's one of them. Now, I'll give you the list. So you have communication, direct or indirect. Evaluating is feedback, negative feedback. How do you give negative feedback? Do you make it direct or indirect? Then you have, the leading, as we said, which was shared. Are you more egalitarian, or are you more top down, like it's one authoritarian? It's like, hey, I say what says, or hey, let's figure that together. How do you decide? Is it top down, or is it more consensual? Then you have trusting. How do you build trust? In some countries, you first have to have a relationship. Like in the Middle East, in Arab countries, you have to first build a relationship. Once I trust you, then we can work together. Which is it's hard to understand to Americans who come to Dubai, the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia. They come like, oh, I'm with this big famous American company. I'm come with a lot of money. And the person is like, no, just relax. We're gonna go smoke some shisha, have some tea, and maybe tomorrow. You see, big clash. Then you have disagreeing. Are you more confrontational or not? Then how do you schedule? So that comes back to the example with the German versus Colombian. Americans, Germans, some countries, it's a straight line, one step after the other. Other places, like maybe France, Colombia, it's kind of flexible. Maybe I work a little bit on this, a little bit on that. Ultimately, it gets done. But for somebody who's used to in a straight line, it's infuriating. It's like, what's going on? So much time wasted. And finally, how do you persuade? Do you first explain the application? Like, hey, I want to cut that tree. Okay, here, take the axe and just do like this. Or do you want to understand the principle first? It's like, well, what is the theory behind it? Why am I doing this? So it's a difference between what to do and why. So when you put, let's say, Germans and like Americans together, if you work with a diverse team, you would have to explain both ways. Just it takes a few more seconds, but this way everybody's on the same page. Otherwise, if you use one way, the other side will be feeling like you speak a foreign language. They'll be confused and uncomfortable. So let's map this out for, let's say, the US. So you see, you have all these different areas, And these dots are like the cultural kind of aggregation, how most people are. It's an average. Remember that. Nobody is at that perfect dot. So you have these different areas. And what you need to remember is not these specifics right now. What you need to remember, what I want you to remember, is that first of all, these dots, coming back to, remember this triangle, that's for the middle level. You see the cultural, the middle one? That's how the group works. But in every country, you might have a person that in one aspect, they're very different. Has nothing to do with the rest of the average. I might be a Hungarian, but in the way I communicate, I might be more like a Japanese. You see, maybe I grew up in Japan. And as we said, with all this easiness, ease of travel, I might have grown up in different places. Actually, I did. I grew up in Hungary, Algeria, and Canada. In some ways, I'm more Canadian. In some ways, more Hungarian. In some ways, more Algerian. So who knows? Now coming back here, so you see that's the US. Now let's superimpose France. Now what do you see? So I'd love to hear what are some comments that we have from the. Oops, I don't see that chat anymore. So I'd love to see what you think. What do you see here? What do you observe? Now you see, in some areas you are similar. Like when it comes to deciding. So if you start working with somebody, let's say an American with a French or a French with an American, if you start working in areas where you're similar, you might be mistaken to believe that you're similar in all the other ways. But that's not the case. If you look at how you persuade, how you convince somebody else, it's on the opposite extremes. It could not be further away. So you see, you might decide in the same way, but when you get to explaining, it doesn't work. The other person is not getting it. Why? You get frustrated. That's the most important thing to understand, that you can be similar and different at the same time. Now, coming back to the example of the French and the US, here you can see why that happens. For the communication, just conveying information, the Americans are more direct. That's the left side. But the French are more indirect. Now, when the French come here, they assume that the Americans are so direct, in the movies, elsewhere, Hollywood, Rambo, they're very direct, tough guys. Direct communication. So why wouldn't they also do that in the feedback? But when they come to work, the Americans are the other way. They're more indirect than direct. So then the French it swaps, it changes space. So that's why they misunderstand each other. So as I explained, the French comes here, when they get a feedback, they don't understand because they're expecting something else. The reverse, when an American goes to France, and instead of getting the first positive feedback, the warm and fuzzy first, instead, the French person gives them the negative. They complain. They're like, oh my God, why are you so negative? Why don't you recognize the good thing that I've done? And again, frustration, one way or the other. Now, when you add another culture, let's say Chinese culture, look at that. There's no overlap. First of all, geographically, they're much further away. And so that's one. So that gives a hint. Most likely that will happen. But also look at this. Look at communication. Communication, the French are closer to the Chinese. They're more indirect, which means that a French person, unless they have some cultural intelligence training, they will have generally an easier time communicating with the Chinese. Now, when it comes to feedback, negative feedback, the Americans are closer to the Chinese. The Americans are better at being indirect. So they will have a better time communicating with the Chinese when it comes to negative feedback. You see, complicated, huh? But again, don't worry about it. Just understanding the basics. You can be similar and different at the same time. And I'll give you some tools so you can navigate this. So let's look at communication. You have the direct, indirect. The question is, how can you be more inclusive? Excuse me. When you're indirect, you want to move toward being, and the other person is more indirect. So from direct to indirect, you can shift toward saying, let's say, instead of saying, oh, this here, so direct would be saying that this object here, oh, this is such an ugly color. Indirect would be saying, well, maybe another color could be better. You see, it's the same message, but delivered differently. Now, when it comes to communication, there was a survey a few years ago, some 65 countries, thousands of executives asking about communication, like, what do you value in communication? And most answer was clarity. Most answer across the country. So why are they not understanding each other? So what happens is you might value clarity, that's below the surface, but what it looks like depends on the culture. So a clear communication for a Japanese is reading the air, very indirect. Clear communication for a German is very direct. But you might have two indirect communicators, let's say Brazilians and Japanese. But what you're supposed to read between the lines, because you're indirect, is different. So they will have trouble communicating together. So I see here in the chat, humans complex. Yes, very complex. Cultures are so complex. You cannot know everything. In the past, before CQ, you were talking about cultural competency, which was about knowing everything about one specific culture. But that's no longer enough. Imagine you're preparing for a meeting in Japan with the CEO. So you learn about, bows and whatever. But you show up there and the CEO is sick and his VP, who grew up in the US, comes and he wants to give you a high five. You come to bow, come to give you a high five. What do? You're like frozen. You don't know what to do. With cultural intelligence is that flexibility of figuring it out. Now, when it comes to communication, another way of being, inclusive is but okay, there's indirect, direct. There's also, are you shy? Do you prefer you're more auditive, you listen, or visual? So in a meeting, you might want to have slides and everything. In some cultures, let's say Asian cultures, in Japan, for example, if you come to a room, say, hey, who has a question? Nobody will speak up, but they will look at you. The people making eye contact, they're waiting for you to call on them because that's their way of being polite. So there were some cases where you had an American in this room and there's nobody has any questions. But then you had the person next to them, another American who was part more cultural intelligence. They saw what was going on. They're like, oh, Mr. Takeshi, do you have a question? And I said, oh, yes, thank you. And they spoke. You see, small nuances. So there's so many layers. In a meeting, you can also have like maybe somebody who's shy would not want to speak up in a big room. So have an open door. Maybe they like to email you or message you on Slack. Have many, many means of communication. So this is a journey. It's quite a journey. Now, how does it begin? This is the global leaders journey that I invite you on. This is a call to adventure. There are many calls to adventure. Some that you cannot refuse. Maybe you're sick or some disease. That's an adventure that you cannot refuse. That's a call to adventure you cannot refuse. Some other calls to adventure are, that's an opportunity, a promotion, an opportunity to travel abroad. A friend invites you, hey, come work at my company, or maybe work in a team. Sometimes it's a colleague from a culture that you're not comfortable with, invites you for dinner, for lunch, who wants to get to know you. Once you have this call to adventure, you can choose to accept or not. Then you gather allies. In my work, that's what I do. My clients, they're on this journey to create a future, to transform themselves, because what got you here won't get you there. So for them, it's about who they need to become to create a future that is better than what they can imagine. And that's the journey. And I'm an ally on that journey. Here, when you learn, you build a team, you have allies, you have your co-founder, your colleagues, maybe friends, trusted friends. Then you cross the thresholds. Then you're in the thick of it. This is the road of trials, where you have issues or miscommunication. This team, that person, oh, it's so frustrating. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. I thought they were going to be finished with this. This doesn't look the way it's supposed to. All these frustrations. Now, worst case, you have boons, lessons. And when you come back from the threshold, you're a master of two worlds. The world before, your original culture, what you did before, and this new way of being an effective leader in a global organization, in an international organization. And the first step is to begin. I always tell my clients, begin before you're ready. Take the first step. Now, the first step is get clear on your why. What would be possible for you if you developed your cultural intelligence? What would be possible for your team, for your life, if you can able to lead a global team with all these diverse experiences really effectively, to build a team that can, whatever the next company you're working on, imagine if that company succeeds, what would be possible for you then? And if you succeed at that again, because it's a global world, you have access now to everything. Instead of having just friends from people who look like you can have diverse friends. I'm Hungarian, I look a certain way. I have some Hungarian friends, but I have a group of Nigerian friends. They always invite me when there's parties, so I get to eat jollof rice. There's some Kenyans that I got to know in Montreal. So when I hang out with them, I understand the humor. We have Tasca. of course, cold, but also with my Colombian friends. You see, but if you only have friends who look like, who are the same way as you have limited options and maybe not so interesting. Then it's about learning about yourself. What is your culture? What is your cultural identity? I'm a Hungarian. I'm a Canadian. I'm a man. I'm an entrepreneur. I also spent some time in the Arab world. All these things influence a little bit my culture. So when I go back to any of these countries, I feel like a foreigner. I'm not fully Hungarian anymore, but I am in some ways, you see. But the good side is that I'm more adaptable. I feel as a foreigner everywhere, but I can get comfortable also everywhere. So, it's a trade-off. And the reason why you want to learn about yourself first is because culture is relative. You need to know where you stand. If you remember on the continuum, there's always somebody who can be more one or less or whatever. Let's say communication. Where are you on the map? You know where you're on the map. Then if let's say somebody else is somewhere else on the map, you can see, are there more direct communicators or less? You know which way to go to adapt what you say, what you do, your body language, so that you can meet them in their comfort zone. Because ultimately, it's not about being right. It's about understanding. It's about what the end goal happens. So if you have cultural intelligence, the other person doesn't have so much, help them. Okay, maybe you do more effort, but that's not what this is about. It's about the end result. It's about making a connection, building relationships, having a great time, creating something amazing. Now, one of the ways to learn is a book series called Culture Smart. It's amazing. Instead, unlike a Lonely Planet, where they talk half a page about the culture and they say what to do, where to eat, this book series talks about the culture for 150 pages. It's an easy read. And every time I travel to a new place, I get this book, if it's available, and I read it. Okay, it takes me 2 hours maybe in the plane. And what this allows me to do, I get to a new place, and when I see the interactions around me, it's like having this augmented reality glasses. I can see, I can understand what's going on and why. Like, okay, I see what they're doing there. Now, in some cases, it was very helpful. When I went to Portugal, the people, they were looking at me like with a scowl, like they looked angry. But luckily, I had read the book. What happened is that in Portugal, for many years, they were not used to having a lot of foreigners. And in that culture, you only smile at your friends, like in Hungary. And so they looked at you because they were curious, not angry. But because they didn't know you, and that curious face was, maybe frowning a little bit because they're trying to understand, who is that person? So instead of feeling like, oh my God, they're not welcoming, I understood. They were just curious. So there's this old lady who was scowling at me. I smiled at her and she smiled back. She understood. I'm come in peace. I come with respect. So this is a great book. And I recommend first, read the one about your culture. Because fish cannot see water because that's what you're in. So you cannot understand your own culture really well until you start traveling, because you do things the way you've always done them, but you don't know why. But this book can help you understand how you do things, knowing where you stand on the map. And then you can read the book for, let's say, where you're traveling and who you're doing business with. That can be very helpful. Another interesting, important thing is your biases, facing your biases. We all have biases. It's a matter of facing them and controlling them. So bias, it's a prejudice or in favor or against one thing, person or a group compared to another, usually in a way that's considered unfair. In the US, if you have people who wear a hoodie and who happen to be black, for many people, it looks like a bad person. But if it's a white person who has a hoodie, there's no issue. On the other side, you have some Asian cultures about like math. I have some friends who were Chinese. They didn't like math, but they resented that everybody assumed that they were like a math genius. So that was maybe positive, but still unfair. Now, unconscious biases are the most tricky ones because they live outside of one's conscious mind. And often it's in conflict with the consciously held values. You might be thinking, you value diversity, you want to welcome equality for gender or whatnot. But maybe while you're hiring an engineer, and when a outspoken black female, a Nigerian engineer comes, you somehow intuitively think like she might not be the good fit. Why? Because maybe subconsciously you assume that an engineer should be very maybe meek, or should have bad hairstyle, or shouldn't be a woman. These are all unconscious biases. So it's important to really face them and take the time to understand them. So think about when you think about other countries, like when you have statements like, oh, all these people, oh, these Hungarians are so lazy, something so generalized, that's a bias. How could you think about it? A whole country be the same way, in a negative way? If you think about it, you realize that's just a bias. You can generalize, but in a way that's not negative. So let's say Hungarians, they love pork, maybe, or the way they create friendships. It takes a while, but then once you're in for life. That's generalized, but you see, it's positive. So generalization can help, but it's not a bias there. Now, once you have these basics, once you know who you are, and you face your biases, you're self-aware, then you seek exposures to get exposed to other people. So when you have the open mind, now you're exposed, all these positive things can come in and you can learn. So whether travel, go to places where they don't speak your language. I love to lose my bearings, or as we say in French, être dépaysé, and then find my bearings in a new country. Like they don't speak my language. That's the best. Go just get lost, and everything is different. But sometimes you don't have to go far. Look at your team. Maybe there's some group of people that you're more comfortable with. For me, Africans from wherever they are, South Americans, we hit it off. Many African friends ask me, well, did you ever live in my country? Because you seem to understand my sense of humor. But you see, some Asian countries I had less experience with. I'm less comfortable. So what I could do is, if I have, let's say, a Chinese American or a Chinese colleague, seek out an opportunity to get to know them. That's exposure. Maybe there are some local events, a local cultural festival. Then you connect with people. First connect, build rapport, and then be curious. Who are they? Why do they do what they do? Once you have a relationship, you can ask questions about, like, hey, that thing, like, why do you make eye contact in such a way? Why do you look below the eye instead of like direct eye contact? They might tell you, in some countries, eye contact with an elder is disrespectful. So you don't look at them directly in the eye. So that could be something you learn. But as you interact with people, sooner or later, you might have some conflict, some friction. They might annoy you. Something might bother you. And that's when you need to stop and hold judgment. Be curious. What's really happening? Why am I feeling this way? What's going on? And when this happens, it's very important to have MRI. Now, not this machine, but MRI stands for most respectful intent. Assume that they mean well. I had an engineer, quickly. So MRI, to assume that they do well, so they mean well. And then what happens is, then it's about, maybe they do something that they do in a way that is polite in their world, but not in yours. I had an engineer who was eating in a certain way. They make like a lot of noise. In my culture, it was like, ooh, that's like a pig. That's like, ooh, we're poorly raised. But for them, making noise is what was polite. That's how you show appreciation of the food. And finally, reflect. Reflect on what happened. Journal, share, discuss with trusted friends. That's how you learn. So setting off on this journey, it's a long one, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming. So I have a question for you. So first of all, imagine you have an Empire State Building, and I will tell you how to knock it over with 29 dominoes. So you have the Empire State Building, 500 meters tall. Okay, you have 29 dominoes in growing sizes. So one can knock over another one that's 1.5 times bigger. Okay, so you have 29 dominoes. The last domino is 500 meters. How tall is the first one? Give me a guess. Put it in the chat, and then we'll be getting to questions very soon. So how tall is the first domino? So let's put it in the chat. What is your guess? Remember, you have 29 dominoes. The last one is 500 meters, diminishing sizes. How tall is the first one? 1 centimeter, okay. Any other guess? Let's see. So for those of you, some of you might know 2 centimeters, okay. Anybody knows Tic Tacs? What is your favorite flavor? The best flavor, of course, is orange. And the reason I'm sharing this is because this is the size of the first domino. Now, I'll show you what it looks like, and then I'll explain why this matters. Let me know if you hear the sound. You hear the sound?
No.
Okay, all right. Just a second.
Everybody knows about playing with dominoes, but what you may not know is that a domino can knock over another domino, which is about 1.5 times larger. So what I have here is a chain of dominoes. Each one is 1.5 times larger than the previous one. And the smallest domino is about 5 millimeters high and 1 millimeter thick. And I will carefully place it. And there are 13 dominoes. And the largest domino, it weighs about 100 pounds and is more than 1 meter tall. Ready?
Peter,
Boom.
the sound is better, but the video is.
That was 13 dominoes.
Yeah.
If I had.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I can send you the link. So basically what happened is, first domino, really small, be able to knock over a bunch on the video. And if it goes, the 29th would knock over a half a kilometer tall building. Now, here's why this is important. When you start anything, maybe a journey, build a company, sometimes it feels overwhelming, even to become a global leader. Like, where do you start? So many steps. So what you need to do is when you feel like overwhelmed or whatever, just look at what is your first domino. What is the smallest step that's so small that you know how to do it today? You know what, it's safe. It's a small experiment. So it's small enough that you can do it, but also it's meaningful, goes in the right direction. So whenever you're stuck, overwhelmed or whatnot, just like, what's the next domino? So we'll take some questions and then have some closing comments. So what questions do we have?
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. You can stop sharing so that we have like a panelist setting, and then we can go on with
Okay.
Thank you so much for a very insightful masterclass and also presentation. I learned a lot, and I remember because I'm from East Africa, when I'm having conversation with the Western people, there's always this clashing that happens, and now it makes a lot of sense because my culture is very different from theirs. So I would like to invite Bob as someone who has mentored a lot of entrepreneurs locally and globally. What are some of the questions, or what are some of the things that you see coming up most of the time, and how do you, maybe like a question that you can ask Peter on how to handle that clashing? So I'll give the time to Bob to give us a little bit more context of what he usually sees when it comes to mentoring these entrepreneurs, and what may be question that you think they can benefit from this webinar.
Okay, yeah, I'd be glad to. First, just a comment, Peter, thank you very much. I've had quite a bit of training in that cultural competency, which you're right, was a term used. And I thought, okay, I'm ready to go. And just as you went through your presentation, I'm going, so that's why, so-and-so reacted that way or said that, because as Nimi said, I work with people from Germany, France, Moscow, Mexico City, Calgary, and each is a little different. Now their commonality is they're all in a startup, right? They're starting up, they're entrepreneurs. So there definitely is some unity to that group. They're kind of going through the same journey. But yeah, I can definitely, even the nuances you talked about, I think really explain how people react. So for the startups and the entrepreneurs I work with, I kind of had 3 categories. One was suppliers, the second was customers, and the third was employees. And I see these cultural differences or challenges coming up in each case. So I'll start with suppliers because that's usually kind of the first introduction to the startup, saying, okay, first thing I have to do is I have to build software. I need an app, I need a website. Everybody goes through it. and they go, oh my gosh, that's going to cost a lot of money. Okay, I want to outsource my development. And they now begin to work with a software team, typically in another country. So here in the US, very often that's in India, but often it's in South America. And they say, these folks are driving me crazy. Like, I can't get the project done. So I guess the question really is, how can I better manage that software development project? What can I do with the team? Because it's usually setting timelines. When will it be done? What is it going to cost? So that's my question is, how do I work with that development team?
Yeah. So what happens is there's different approaches. So what you want to bridge is the cultural gap. So ideally, what might happen is if you can find somebody who is maybe from that country, but who lives in the US, who has both sides and is competent, obviously, then that person can do the management for you. The other way, if sometimes it's about finding a person over there who has had the exposure, maybe somebody who has lived in both places. Now, these are the easiest ways. The other way is to really understand, well, how did they think? So let's say if you do some of these research, talk to somebody like me, for example, then we can see, well, what is the situation? And some cases, it's about just making small changes in the communication. So let's say with the Indian example, then in India, saying no is very hard, because for them, it's like that would undermine the relationship. So they're going to do anything but to say no.
Yeah.
So what happens is that you're asking the wrong question. Don't ask a question where the answer can be no. Ask an open-ended question, indirect question, so you can give them the opportunity to give you the answer that you want, but also know what you're expecting. So if let's say, you can say, instead of saying, will this be ready next week? They're going to say yes. Right. But if you ask a question like, may there be some challenge? Would it be beneficial to have more time for this? If they say yes, then that's a sign. Also, if they say that they will try, they usually says no. So then if you put them in that context, know what, it's an English word.
Yeah.
Try. But it can have different meanings. So understanding these nuances. So that's in the beginning. So knowing where you start off, but also knowing that, let's say in that specific case, once you build trust, they become more direct in their communication. So spend time on that. Understanding, maybe by reading the book, is that they're very relational. Many Indian engineers who come to California here, they're lost, because over there they used to have these relationships with their friends, with their colleagues, even like personal, even outside of work. They come here, people are nice at work, but they don't want to talk to them after work. They feel like lost. So understanding that, so you have these, like, when you ask them how you doing, don't do like an American says, how you doing? And it's not really a question, it's just like a way of saying hi. Instead, really ask the question, like, how are you doing? How's your family? When you do that, you build that relationship. They will share something that might feel like too much information for, let's say, a Hungarian or an American, but that's how you build a relationship. So that's one more way. You build a relationship, they start to become more open. Also, that you can have more this frank conversation. It's like, hey, this is what I'd like you to do, but explain why. There was an example of a group of Saudis who were in Switzerland for a talk. It was like a full day webinar, and they would show up kind of late to a session, but they would delay everything else afterwards. And so the Erin Meyer, who wrote the book on Culture Map, told them, not just please be on time, but explain why. Is when you are late, this is what happens, that you get less time, it pushes everybody else. And once these Saudis realize, oh my God, our action has a negative impact, guess what? The next day, every single one person was on time. So what happens is we can all act in all the other ways. We're all human, but there's our preference. Sure. And often we have no idea that we should be doing the other way, So to recap, this is first, the easiest way is find somebody who can bridge the culture. If not, then, come with an open mind. And one of, what I put on my last slide always is this thing of be open-minded, patient, and humble. With that approach, you can figure out, you can navigate, well, who are those people that you're working with? Not the generalization of, let's say, Colombians, but those people. Get to know them, but be patient with yourself and them. And then eventually you can figure out something where maybe it's not as efficient. That's the thing. Maybe it's not as efficient as what you would have had back home, but don't be stuck in a form. Be open-minded. Your aim is not to be right or to do perfectly a certain way, is to co-create something that is better. So maybe it's 10% slower, but 50% cheaper. Right. And that might be good.
And what's going through my mind as you're talking, it's almost, hey, let's have the initial discussion, let's say the scope of the project. This is what we want to do, but almost hit the pause button to say, now let's get to know each other. Let's take that time to maybe bridge that gap. And especially if you have somebody, here in America that has, been to New Delhi, grew up there, let's say, or in Mumbai, that would be sort of a good way of starting out. Because I know Americans, of course, theirs is, here's the project, go. Let's jump in and let's start, immediately. And I could see that direct approach could be off-putting too.
And what I would do is maybe change it up. When you first talk, first build the rapport. Because the connection, how you doing, and have no rush. Make them feel like you're there to really listen,
Okay.
not just checking the box. Also, what you can do with an international team is, first of all, whoever you are, what do you like? What are you curious about? I like food and I like to travel. And I know about the food of Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, even Senegal, the dege, which is like something that you give the children at home. It's not something you give to guests because it's something so simple. But I know about it because I ask questions, because I'm curious. Now, the way it's useful is when I meet a new person, and I see that from the name, they might be Ghanaian or Nigerian, I drop some, what I call this cultural name dropping. Now, because I was curious and because I connected in meaningful relationships with these people, they opened up to me enough to that I know inside. I know there's an insider joke between these two countries about the jollof rice, who makes the best one. So when I meet a new person, what I do is like, oh, you're from the land of the jollof, where they make the second best jollof rice, right? First, they're like, who's this white dude? What does he know about jollof? And he knows even that insider joke. So I go immediately from must be some like this, all these other Americans, all these other white people who do not understand us, to, he appreciates my culture. He's curious. He knows something about me. He's not like the other guys, so already trust is one level. Now, what you can do is, whoever these are, ask about what you're interested in. Hey, how's it going? How's your country? Where do you like to travel? Some Indians have never left the country, but they're very curious. I got people coming up to me wanting to take, pictures. They came from another state. And as you work with them, throughout the session, what you can do as a check-in each time is, tell me one thing that happened in your part of the world that impacted you.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a big monsoon, maybe it's a Holi, a big festival. So you get to first see like, that thing in the news. I know somebody who's affected by that, and then become curious. So you can connect like, that's how this all connects. And always I ask open-ended questions like, that festival, Holi, what does that mean for you? Why is it important? You see, they can give you like these things that help you give like depth of understanding of what drives them. And slowly, maybe have an open mind, you get to know them over time. But it's always, be patient. So do this first, and then sometimes it will organically, in some countries, organically transfer into the business side, and then keep it open-ended.
Okay. Yeah, that's very helpful. Very helpful. And then the next question, usually customers, because so often, especially with websites and whatever commerce you're into, you have people that, you get that first, I call it international order. And somebody from India, or Dubai wants to purchase your item. And so then there's the next challenge is whether it's as simple as, I need to translate my website, but then they find that, I need to return my item, and I know in some countries you return, other countries, you don't return. So what would be your recommendation there of how do you then begin to evaluate, how do I do, commerce with these other countries? So it's really with the customer.
So here, what may be the most helpful is to find somebody who is local and who has a really good understanding of their culture. And what I mean is that they're not stuck in the bottle with the that fish, with the water, who are just like, I'm a MBA, really well educated, experience, but they cannot tell you what is the communication preference as a culture. So somebody who is like that by cultural, maybe American and let's say Chinese or Indian, and somebody who can help you understand what is the culture, what is desirable and acceptable for doing business there.
Yeah.
So then based on that, you can do the procedure. Now, as far as the website, you have to localize. One mistake I've done in the past, in one of my first companies, I thought like, Spanish was Spanish. It is not. The Spanish in Spain, even Mexico And like Venezuela, it's not the same Spanish. You know, there's the expressions are different. And I should have known this because I moved from Hungary to Canada, French Canada, and France and Quebec, very different French. So the language, they localize for sure. But because there's so many nuances here, is find somebody who can competently, really insightfully explain, help you navigate that. Now, this whole thing about how to, the policy to return, here it's accepted, but in a culture where it's very new, they might not understand it. I'm like, oh my God, what does this mean? That means I can use this for free and to send that back. When some Hungarians were first exposed to like some policy of you have 90 days to bring things back, they're like, oh my God, this is like so good. So they kept bringing things back because it was so not used to it. So it's really about understanding what that local culture, what's the idea, so that you as a business don't suffer from unsustainable practices, but also you can serve them. And by the way, the cultural intelligence is so important here because what is desirable, what is acceptable, what is attractive depends on the culture.
Exactly.
So how you have a product, how you want to message it, it will depend. And that's why you have different magazines. The cover of the same magazine in different countries might look so different because what's visually desirable is different. And if you take the same magazine, you swap in, let's say, GQ, you swap the design, just the design style. Both countries would say like, oh, this is so ugly. You see, because what is considered pretty for them is different.
Yes, they're very different. And I think your localization, and it's something I advocate too, is not to try to, bring your commerce, your products out to all different countries, because they get very excited. They go, oh my gosh, I have people from all over the world that want to buy my product. And especially if they have to ship it, obviously some more, problems and challenges there. So now, was there anyone else in the chat that had a question?
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you so much. The last point, the last point literally hit home on how what is culturally acceptable when it comes to visuals is so different from any other country. I think that's very, very, very important. And it also brings me, we're learning about how Tigo was very successful in India. And once they got in Rwanda and Africa, they literally had to merge with Airtel because of the culture, clashing. So they did not study so well on what's accepted in India and what is to be accepted in Africa, especially in East Africa, in even West Africa. So I think, Peter, and also the questions that Bob asked is very, very important when it comes to cultural intelligence and how to bridge that gap. So thank you so much. So this question is asked by Sam. I think any one of you can take it, but especially Peter, on how have you managed skepticism that comes from cultural inhibitions or historic events?
So do you mean, like, just to clarify, do you mean like, let's say you have two countries that had like past wars, like India and Pakistan, and then because of that you have friction? Is that what you mean? Yeah. Okay. Yes. So those are quite challenging, because if somebody who has never been anywhere else and who are really deeply in this soup of culture of like reinforced whether it could be this hatred for these people in the US, it's like you have racism, which is like just like it's part of the soup that you grew up in. You don't realize what's going on, so it can be very challenging. Now, what the process that you can do is you want to have people realize what they have in common, and see the other as a human being. Yes, in the big picture, like for me as a Hungarian, like some of my family members, they come from the Transylvania, which is now in Romania. And they have this strong hatred for Romanians. And some of my family members told me this, and I was like, oh, I'm supposed to hate them. Okay. But after a while, I was like, well, they seem like the other people. But what have they done to me? But what happens is, it's about connecting with them on a human level. Be curious. So, I mean, if you don't have an issue, that's easy. You're trying to help other people do that. So one way to do that is to put them in situations where they can connect on something common. Not work related, but like something else, some activities, facilitate some kind of discussions. Now, if it's really, really bad, then maybe it might be interesting to have a talk, facilitate conversations around that specific thing. So bring the Name the elephant in the room. Maybe something around like, well, how do you feel about this event? What does this mean to you? So when everybody can voice that, then the other person can see like, oh, that's how they see us. And then often when this happens, each side can see that the other person is not the enemy. This is just like some politicians from way before. So however you do, this is like a quest. It's not a path. A path would be when you know the exact steps. A quest is when you have a fuzzy kind of goal, which is to, let's say, create a great team dynamic, but you don't know the steps. You explore. So try different things, and your aim is to have them build rapport, build connection, get to know each other as human beings. When that happens, then the dehumanizing aspect of war, of conflict, is replaced by realizing that, well, hey, that person is, I'm supposed to hate these people from these Hungarians. They're bad. They stole part of my country 50 years ago. But, this Hungarian here seems to be all right. He has children like me. He likes jollof rice like me. He loves travel like me, So once you focus on what you have in common, that can start the process. But if you, let's say, build a business and you have these big teams, who are in those different countries, sometimes it can be very difficult. It may take months or however long for the process. So in that case, what you might want to do is, unfortunately, separate them. So let's say you have this one team that deals on this part, and somebody who doesn't have those issues or who has gone through the process can bridge the gap, because ultimately you have a business to run, and sometimes it takes longer. But the aim should always be to try to build these bridges. And for you, it's best for you to understand what's going on. If you come from the US or Hungary and you have no idea of the geopolitical situations there, you come in, you're like, why don't you guys talk to each other? Oh, you're bad team members, because you don't understand. So talk to locals, gather allies. Gather allies, local people you can trust, who know these differences, have conversations, become curious. If there's more friction than you expect, like, what's going on? Open-ended questions. Oh, tell me what's going on. One-on-one with each different people that you have some relationship with. When you do that, it might open up a little bit. There's a little bit of a hint. Scratch a little bit more. Maybe go have a meal, have a conversation, and gently, explore. And over time, hopefully, it's going to get better.
Thank you so much, Peter. From what I'm hearing is actually like, instead of making assumptions or try to think in the place of people, ask questions. Just like a little bit, don't be aggressive, but just try to understand where they're coming from before you come to conclusions. And I think that is very, very important when it comes to culture, even in the company, even as an employee, because most of the time we always jump to conclusions instead of asking, is this what I'm hearing? We always, just like, someone is just trying to insult me, we always jump to conclusion. And I think what Peter is trying to tell us here is, before you jump to conclusion, when you know someone has a different culture than yours, ask open-ended questions so that you understand where they're coming from and also understanding their context. I was going to ask you a question. Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Just maybe some example to give some color to this. So yes, validate your assumptions. But this especially is true for people who are very experienced. If you have a track record of being an executive, let's say in the US, I'm a great executive. I don't need coaching. I don't need this and that. But you go somewhere else, you fall flat on your face. That's why 50% of expat assignments end early. And when you replace an executive, that costs 4 or 5 times whatever the salary was. Joint ventures, 70% fail. Why? Cultural differences. So as a leader, when you come to a new context, you have to start from scratch. It's like, you go to a place you've never been, take out the GPS. Don't assume that your way of leading is the good way. In the US, what's a good leadership is to be, self-effacing humor, kind of approachable. You ask questions, call me by my first name. In Morocco, a good leader is somebody who doesn't let themselves be called by the first name. They know the answer. They give the answer. They're not questioned. They don't ask questions. So imagine that American leader who's very, very, very successful and competent goes to Morocco, tries to lead that way. What's going to happen is that the locals will think he's incompetent. Like, why is he asking me the question what I think? He should know. He disrespects himself by allowing people to call him by the first name. You see, assumptions. The other thing about companies who are successful, Walmart, when I went to Germany, they fell flat on their face, costing them $1 billion over 7 years. Why? Cultural assumptions. In the US, you have these usually like older people with like this blue apron who welcome you, like, hello, how you doing? Big smile. And they ask you, oh, how can I help you? In Germany, first of all, if you smile at somebody and you're not a friend, then you're like a weirdo. Like, why are you smiling at me? Are you crazy? Second, when you ask how you're doing, that's none of your business, unless you're a friend. So the buyers were put off because you have these people following them around the store, asking them how they're doing and trying to help them when they're like, no, I don't know you. So this was just one of the many cultural issues. So they went away, but then they learned. They came back with a partnership with Tesco, I think is a local company, who understood the culture. Look at IKEA. They came to the US, they brought everything, including their tiny, by American standards, tiny beds and bed sheets. Now, Americans like their bigger beds. They didn't want to change. So nobody was buying those smaller European-sized beds. So IKEA had to wrap up all their sheets and their bed and bed frames and bring it all back to Europe. And they had to then ask, figure somebody who can, deliver the beds that were desirable in that market. So again, assumptions can be at any level. It doesn't matter how smart you think you are or how successful in the past. When you work across cultures, it starts from scratch. Validate your assumptions. You might be, the same thing might work, but chances are it won't. So validate your assumption, and then you go.
That's very
Perfect.
powerful. I really wish we had a lot of time to talk about, I think maybe, I don't know if you have time to talk about how to build culture in the company. Now we have scratched the surface of culture intelligence, understanding where other people are coming from, understanding why someone is not telling you no, why someone is not showing up on time, why someone has to go through the corners. Sometimes in Africa we are like, don't pass through the corners, come straight to me. So but sometimes people just like go through the corners. So that's very, very important. We might have another time where we talk about how to build that culture and how to be an influence in that culture and how to succeed within that culture. But time is not on our side. So I just want to, to thank you, Peter, and thank you, Bob, for just like giving us this time and this insight. So this class was really, really needed. Peter, you say that you have just like few words to wrap us around. So please go ahead and wrap up, and then that will be the end of our session for today.
Yeah. So, we talked about many things, and many things might fly over your head. But what I want you to remember is a couple of really simple things. Is that when it comes to cultural differences, you can be both similar and different at the same time. Don't assume. And also, sometimes you have an experience, let's say, in one aspect. Let's say maybe they can be a great friend here, but as a boss, they might be really bad for you, so they can be different things. So when somebody, a colleague of yours or somebody tells you something, they have a different experience than you of a person, don't invalidate their experience. Be curious, like what's going on. The final thing is this. In all these situations that I described, if you approach it with an open mind, like there might be another way. Whatever you thought was always the universal truth might not be the same elsewhere. Open mind is very important. Second, humility. To know that you might be the one who's mistaken. And finally, patience, but patience with everybody, with the others, but also with you. This is not easy. I mean, all information is available, yet still, most people fail at this because it's so counterintuitive. Most people, by default, when they're born, when they grow up, they assume that their way is the best and most desirable. They just think everybody is going to one day figure out their way and want to be like them, but everybody else thinks the same way. There's more than one way of doing things, and it doesn't mean it's better or worse. It's just different. So open mind, patience, and humility. With those basics, you go on this journey, and I know you will figure it out and be successful. And I'm also here to support you. So feel free to reach out. If I can be an ally on that journey for you, it will be my honor.
Thank you so much,
Perfect.
Peter. Thank you so much, Peter. I don't know if, Bob, you have any insights, but thank you so much for your time. And this video, we are going to put it on YouTube, and we can also link Peter's LinkedIn and Bob's LinkedIn, just in case you want to reach out to them for more insights or follow up with more of these masterclasses that they're going to be driving. But really understand that when you say about understand that people don't have to go your way, because I read a book when it says people are always thinking about themselves. You're thinking about you, I'm thinking about me, I'm thinking another one is thinking. The more you understand that, that's where you understand that we're just different people, but we can meet in the middle. So this brings us to the end of our session. I just want to thank our panelists, but also thank our audience for sticking with us for more than 1 hour and 19 minutes. This meeting was set to last 1 hour and 30 minutes, but you can save 11 minutes for you, grab some water or some coffee. So see you the next time. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good day.